Hello, Internet, and welcome to episode 61 on a Deep Neurons podcast. I have said the same thing in the recording, and I'm really sorry. I don't have a guest for you this week, which should be fine. I came up with this episode idea that I wanted to record for 10 minutes, and the reason I haven't been recording is because one, I'm buried under assignments. Two, because I just finished moving. I no longer live where I used to live before. And the third one is because I've been looking at the numbers that I've been getting on my episodes, especially on YouTube. Anchor is fine, like people are listening on audio, it's fine. But on YouTube, it's been specifically discouraging. I am so sorry. I don't know what else to do. I've been trying to record all day and eventually I fell asleep and woke up in the morning and still this shit is going on. Anyway. It has been very discouraging, the fact that the podcast hasn't been growing. But I'll tell you something that has encouraged me is that one of my Patreon supporters has raised their pledge, and two of my regular listeners have also joined, providing for this podcast. And if you're out there, the four people who support this podcast on a regular basis and other two people who make timely donations to this podcast, you're the one keeping this show going at this point. And thank you very much. I appreciate it. You're the reason I get to do what I love to do, and you're the best thing in the world. Well, that's that. Moving on. I think there's nothing else left to say. Just let's cue the fucking... Hello, Internet, and welcome to episode 61 of the Deep Neurons podcast. I'm pretty sure you've heard the intro, so, actually that has nothing to do with this. Anyway, I'll start right off the beginning why I was thinking about this. So, I've been reading some Gilles Deleuze and a bunch of shit by John Dewey, who is a critique of democracy, and another dude, and this is a name you should be alarmed about, and this is the dude you should know about, Carl Schmitt's criticism of liberalism. Now, the last one I did not know while I was reading it was a completely sworn Nazi, and for a very long time I was actually very accepting of the criticism that he had for liberalism as it stood back when it was just brewing in democracies. Just pointing out that liberalism had legitimate criticism from a Nazi. That's it. That's what I wanted to tell you guys. But at the same time, he's a Nazi. Who knows? Maybe it was political propaganda I fell for. And then I looked at what it means to have an ideal world. It's basically saying, hey, this is the practical world that we all live in, and it could be more efficient, it could be more ethical, it could be more up to our principles, it could be the dream world if such and such thing is to be done, or this is the way it would be ideal. And usually most of our lives are staying in the practical and chasing the ideal, and we die before we get there. Wow, that got bleak quick, but that's not the point of the podcast. Usually, that's how most of our lives are. And the reasons why most of our political promises fail, or people who we put faith in, especially the left, fail, is because we're extremely idealistic people who have no praxis. Praxis being a practical way of establishing what we want. And even if we find a way to establish what we want, then it's not the same ideals that all of us share. And the reason that tends to happen is that, well, in the last, say, 20 years, our literacy rate has dramatically risen. Not that it is very great now or it was very poor before. It has been a significant amount. And the same has been the case everywhere else. People are going to college more in the years from 2000 to 2020 than they were from, say, 1950 to 2000. The frequency of people going to colleges has increased. Also has student debt, but not necessarily the same, not necessarily the only driving factor there. And that means that people have more time and space to think about what they want from their politicians. And when they come up with an answer for that question, they usually have a set of characteristics that will chase their ideal and will make a conducive environment for them to prosper in, which eventually will be their political praxis. And if you have noticed a trend, it's that most of the college students, especially to come out in the last 15 years or 20 years for that matter, have been extremely or moderately left leaning. And the reason that the case is the left has never been the praxis people. I know this could be a controversial statement, to be honest, but I've never seen a philosopher who's very far left or even moderately left to mostly talk about what works. But they have very, very convincingly talked about how it should be. Karl Marx, for example, diagnosed the problems of the capitalistic system and basically told the people who were reading his things how it should not be. Hegel did the same thing when he talked about his thesis antithesis. He talked about, well, the following of the government, but at the same time he did talk about how everybody's chasing this ideal and how it should not be are the things we're learning from this thesis antithesis and synthesis of thesis sort of conversation. But on the other hand, most people who've seized power from the right, it's because they say what I do might not be perfect, but it works. It gets the job done. And that's where we usually stand now, I mean, at least politically. And that's not necessarily a good thing. Just because something gets the job done doesn't mean it's perfect. You know what I mean? Like, for example, you could drown a rat because you don't have you don't have access to forest. That's not necessarily a good thing. And hence I came up with this episode idea. And the other sort of layer that I wanted to add to this is the stuff I read about Plato's world of ideal forms. Now, most of you would know, and like what it is, because, well, I believe these are cultured individuals. The Plato's world of forms sort of that entire theory sort of in crux says this, that suppose there's a chair that you want to build. There is a universe where an ideal chair exists, where the criteria that makes up a chair is perfectly met, and is perfectly made into this heavenly perfect body of a chair. Wow. I've just moved out, by the way. This is all my neighbors. I live in a very busy square. Why am I doxing myself? Never mind. Wow. So, as I was saying, the Plato's world of forms basically has an ideal world where everything has a perfect ideal existence, and however you practically remake it is an inferior copy of the same. And the more complicated the system is, the further away will it be from the ideal. For example, the example of the chair. There is an ideal chair that exists in this ideal world of forms that only exists in this abstract ideas that we access it in. But the moment a carpenter takes his tools and makes it, it becomes an inferior copy of that ideal. That ideal, because that ideal could shift, it could change to what you want it to be, but not necessarily will that translate into a chair that we make into a real thing. And the more complicated these things are, like I said, the more problematic their establishment will be. So when an ethical consumption problem comes up, consumption by itself, it becomes a problem for all of us. So an ethical consumption is definitely a compromise. Ethical living, for that matter, with consumption, then becomes a bigger compromise. And the more you get to chasing your ideal, the more complex your praxis becomes. And that's where we find ourselves now. Which is why committing to your political belief is now such a problem, especially if you're on the left. The right, on the other hand, has, well, either chosen that it works how we're going about this, or this is a temporary solution until a better solution arrives. I don't necessarily agree, and this is the right that I think is capable of critical thinking. There's of course the unreasonable, unnecessarily passionate right about traditions, which I don't want to deal with. I don't think they're the same people as it works, but all of them make the same argument. Well, that's all I had. That's all the canon I had in my brain. Thank you for listening. Well, children, that's all I have for you this week. Traffic noises and a child saying how practical implications of his political ideology might be the problem here. Not that practical implications, but practically applying the political principles that I stand by might be the problem. Well, of course, there's also the pervasive hijack of the right and the shift from globalization to regional politics that we're all stuck in after 2016. But I'm not a political commentator. This is just a headcanon idea. I hope everybody understands that. And I don't think I've said anything controversial. So, like, share, subscribe. Share it with your parents if you want. And well, keep reading. Support me on Patreon if you think the content is worth it or the content is as good as I think it is. The other thing I wanted to tell you is there's going to be a tiny change in the way the episodes are coming out. So what's been happening is that I've been trying to follow a weekly schedule that an episode comes out every week, and that was working for a very long time. But ever since I've gotten a regular place to be, which is college, it has gotten very difficult to do that. So I'm gonna have to release as many episodes as I can while I'm free, and then there might be a long period of silence, or there might be a regular schedule. I don't know. So what I'm gonna do is record the podcast the moment I get time, and then I'm just gonna, release them the moment I get them. And now that we have a $15 tier supporter, I'm gonna have to record everything and wait for 24 hours until all of you can see it. If you don't know, $15 of supporting on Patreon gets you early access. So that's that. Have a nice week. I'll see you next time, which might not be in a week actually. It might be like 2 days later. Next up, for people who listen to the podcast regularly, Bad in Bollywood is gonna be here. So strap in. Yeah. See you guys. Bye.